A wealthy man abandons his fiancée, only to see her years later with quadruplets. He demands to take them, but her response leaves him speechless. Claire sat in the bridal suite, adjusting her veil with trembling hands, while her best friend Emily did her best to reassure her. "The ceremony should have started by now," Claire whispered, glancing at the clock. Emily forced a smile. "He loves you, Claire. He's just running late because he wants everything to be perfect." But Claire wasn't convinced. Richard was never late. Anxiety tightened in her chest as the minutes dragged on. Then, the door opened, and the priest stepped inside, his face solemn. "I'm so sorry, Miss Claire," he said gently. "Richard isn't coming." The words hit like a wrecking ball. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the edge of the table for support. Tears blurred her vision, smudging her makeup. "This can't be happening," she murmured. "There must be some mistake." Without waiting for an answer, Claire bolted from the room. Guests turned to watch as she ran down the aisle, humiliation burning through her like fire. She burst out of the church, scanning the parking lot in desperation. But Richard was nowhere to be seen. Heart pounding, she looked up at the sky, blinking back the flood of tears. How could he do this? Why? What had she done wrong? Then, like a cruel flashback, she remembered their conversation 2 weeks ago. Richard had held her hand, his expression distant. "Are you sure about this?" he'd asked. "Of course," Claire had replied, confused. "We love each other, don't we?" He had hesitated before forcing a smile, one that now, in hindsight, she realized had been fragile, a silent warning she had ignored. Across the street, hidden in his car, Richard watched her. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "This marriage isn't right for you, Richard. Think about your future." He gripped his phone, guilt churning inside him. He knew what he had done was cruel, but he hadn't had the courage to face Claire or the expectations that weighed on him. Meanwhile, Claire wiped her tears, inhaled deeply, and made a decision. She would leave. She wouldn't let herself be pitied. And Richard, still sitting in his car, knew that what he had done was irreversible. The day after the disastrous wedding, Claire packed a bag and left the city without a word. No goodbyes, no explanations. She boarded a bus heading anywhere but here. Every mile that passed made her heart ache, but she had no choice. Staying wasn't an option. At first, it was unbearable. She rented a tiny room in an unfamiliar town, took a job at a cafe, and tried to rebuild her life, piece by piece. But the shame and heartbreak lingered. Then, one day, something changed everything. 2 months had passed, and Claire couldn't shake the exhaustion, nausea, and strange sensations in her body. She blamed it on stress until she finally bought a pregnancy test. That night, in her tiny apartment bathroom, she stared at the result. Positive. Her hands trembled, fear and disbelief tangled in her chest. She was going to be a mother, alone. No support, no family nearby. But then, a strange calm settled over her. This child was her second chance. She scheduled a doctor's appointment, bracing herself for reality, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The doctor smiled warmly as he examined the ultrasound. "Congratulations, Claire," he said. "It's 4. She blinked. 4? "Quadruplets," the doctor confirmed. The world tilted. She gripped the edge of the examination table, her breath unsteady. "Will I be able to do this?" she whispered, more to herself than to the doctor. He simply smiled. Mothers always find a way. From that moment, everything changed. Claire worked harder than ever, saving every cent. Her tiny room wasn't enough anymore, so she moved into a modest house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it would be home to her children. People admired her determination. Even while carrying 4 babies, she balanced work, doctor visits, and preparing for their arrival. But it wasn't easy. Some nights, she cried alone, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. And sometimes, a painful thought crept into her mind. If Richard knew, would he even care? She shoved the thought away each time. Her children were her future. No one, not even Richard, would take that away from her. As the months flew by, she barely had time to breathe between hospital visits and organizing the house. But she pushed forward, determined to be the mother her children deserved. And then, just when she thought she was finally in control, fate brought Richard back into her life. The day finally arrived. Claire had prepared for months, but nothing could have fully readied her for what was about to happen. The delivery was complicated, but in the end, all 4 babies arrived safely. As she held each of them in her arms, an overwhelming wave of love filled her heart. Love unlike anything she had ever known. In that moment, all of her doubts and fears melted away. From then on, she knew she would do whatever it took to give them the best life possible. 5 years passed, and Claire had fully embraced life as a single mother of quadruplets. Her once quiet home was now filled with the sound of laughter, playful chaos, and toys scattered in every corner. Each of her sons had their own distinct personality. Lucas, the inquisitive one, always full of questions. Noah, the gentle and affectionate one. Liam, the jokester, constantly making everyone laugh. And Oliver, the natural leader, always organizing his brothers in their mischievous adventures. Life was exhausting, but Claire found it fulfilling. She worked multiple jobs, determined to provide for her family. No matter how hard it got, she never complained. Every smile from her boys reminded her why she kept pushing forward. But life is never predictable. One afternoon, as she took the boys to the park to play, Claire spotted someone she never expected to see again. She stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching. Sitting on a bench a short distance away was Richard. He was engaged in conversation with someone, but when his gaze met Claire's, his expression changed instantly. His eyes flickered toward the 4 boys playing nearby. The resemblance was undeniable. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She had dreaded this moment for years, and now it was happening. Richard looked from her to the children, his shock evident. Claire gripped her bag tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. She had to leave before he could approach her. "Lucas, Noah, Liam, Oliver," she called out, her voice slightly louder than usual. "It's time to go home." The boys groaned in protest, asking for more time to play, but the urgency in her tone made them listen. As they hurried to gather their toys, Claire turned to lead them away. Then, a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Claire!" The sound of her name, spoken in that voice, made her stomach twist. Slowly, she turned, meeting Richard's intense gaze. "Richard," she said, trying to sound composed, but her voice betrayed her. He looked between her and the boys again, his expression shifting from shock to something unreadable. "Are they your children?" His voice was hesitant, but the answer was obvious. Claire hesitated, her cheeks growing warm. There was no avoiding it now. "Yes," she said, firmly. "They're my children." Richard took a step closer, his eyes scanning their faces, taking in every detail. He seemed to be processing the truth in real time. "How old are they?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Claire swallowed hard. 5. Richard's face fell. It was as if the air had been knocked out of him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, still trying to absorb the weight of what she had just confirmed. "Are they mine?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Claire felt her world tilt. She had spent years preparing for this possibility, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. Still, she refused to hide the truth. "Yes, Richard," she said evenly. "They're yours." Silence stretched between them. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit she remembered all too well. He looked at the boys again, his expression unreadable, before finally turning back to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was lower now, tinged with hurt and frustration. Claire let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms. "You left me, Richard," she said, her voice firm. "You abandoned me without a word. I was humiliated, alone, and pregnant. What was I supposed to do?" Richard blinked, struggling to respond. He knew she was right. He had no excuse. "I need to meet them," he said, after a long pause. Claire instinctively stepped back. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They don't know who you are." "Why not?" His tone hardened. "I'm their father." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "A father?" she echoed. "You don't know what that word means, Richard. You weren't there when I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to feed them. You weren't there when I was changing 4 diapers at once, or working myself to exhaustion to keep a roof over our heads. You left me to do it all alone." Richard swallowed hard, but stood his ground. "I know I made a mistake," he admitted. "But that doesn't change the fact that they're my children too. I have the right to know them." Claire's jaw tightened. "The day you walked away, you gave up that right." Before Richard could respond, a small voice interrupted them. "Mommy, who's that man?" Claire looked down to see Lucas, his curious brown eyes fixed on Richard. Richard crouched down, his face softening for the first time. "Hey there, champ," he said with a small smile. "My name is Richard." Lucas tilted his head. "Do you know my mommy?" Richard chuckled lightly, glancing at Claire before replying, "Yeah, I do." Claire took a deep breath and gently nudged Lucas back toward his brothers. "Go play for a little longer, sweetheart. Mommy will be there soon." As Lucas ran back to the playground, Claire turned to Richard, her expression steely. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be fine," she said. "That's not how this works." Richard shook his head. "I'm not expecting everything to be fixed overnight," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm not walking away this time, Claire. Not again." Claire felt a surge of panic. She knew Richard wasn't the type of man to walk away easily. That evening, she returned home with the boys, her heart heavy. As she tucked them into bed, she couldn't stop thinking about what was coming next. No matter how much she wanted to shield her children, she knew it would be nearly impossible to keep Richard away now that he knew the truth. Across town, Richard sat in his upscale apartment, staring out the window. Thoughts of Claire and the boys swirled in his mind. What if he had made a different choice all those years ago? How different would their lives be now? For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his past decisions and the pressing need to make things right. Claire barely had time to recover from the unexpected encounter before, just days later, there was a knock at her door. She hesitated before opening it, and there he was again. Richard stood before her, his face set with determination, his eyes filled with something between regret and resolve. "Claire, we need to talk," he said firmly. She crossed her arms. "We have nothing to talk about, Richard. I'm not leaving until we do." Tension hung thick in the air. Claire knew she couldn't avoid this conversation forever. Before she could respond, Lucas appeared in the hallway, his curious gaze fixed on the man at the door. "Mommy, it's the man from the park," he said, his voice filled with innocence. Claire forced a smile, but before she could redirect him, Richard seized the moment. "Hey there, champ," he said, kneeling to Lucas's level. "My name is Richard." Lucas tilted his head, intrigued, but Claire quickly intervened. "Lucas, sweetheart, go back to your room. I'll be there soon." Lucas hesitated but eventually obeyed. Once he disappeared down the hall, Claire turned back to Richard, her patience wearing thin. "You can't just show up and talk to them like this," she snapped. Claire, they're my children, Richard countered. I have the right to know them. She let out a sharp laugh, bitterness laced in every word. A right? You lost that right the day you left me at the altar. I raised them alone, Richard. Do you have any idea what that was like? The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the constant worry. And now, after all these years, you think you can just show up and pretend none of that happened? Richard inhaled deeply, clearly trying to keep his emotions in check. He knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. I know I made a terrible mistake, he admitted. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but it doesn't change the fact that they're my children too. Claire's heart clenched. She wanted to protect them from everything, but she also knew Richard wasn't a man who backed down easily. What do you want, Richard? She asked, exhausted. I want to know them, to spend time with them. Is that really too much to ask? His voice held genuine intent. It is too much, she shot back. They don't even know who you are. I'm not going to let you disrupt their lives. Richard was silent for a moment before speaking the words Claire had dreaded most. If you don't let me be part of their lives, I'll take this to court. The threat hit her like a punch to the gut. The silence that followed Richard's departure was deafening. Claire knew what was coming, a battle she wasn't sure she was prepared for. Days later, the summons arrived. Richard had officially filed for joint custody. Claire's world tilted beneath her. Her first reaction was pure outrage. He had been absent for 5 years, and now he wanted legal rights? It made no sense. Desperate for guidance, she turned to Amelia, her longtime friend and an experienced attorney. Sitting in Claire's small kitchen, Amelia flipped through the legal documents, her expression serious. Claire, we need to be realistic, she said carefully. Richard has money, resources, and a powerful legal team. But you have something he doesn't, a history of dedication. You've been there for the boys every single day. Claire clenched her coffee cup, her hands trembling. And what if that's not enough? It will be, Amelia assured her. We'll fight with everything we've got. We'll gather evidence, testimonies, anything that proves you're the best person to care for them. Claire nodded, but the weight of the impending battle pressed heavily on her. She had fought so many battles alone, but this one terrified her. When the initial court hearing arrived, Claire walked into the courtroom with Amelia by her side. Across the room, Richard stood with his lawyer. But what caught Claire off guard was the woman standing beside him, Stella, his fiancée. A wave of anger surged through her at the sight of Stella. She looked completely at ease, as if this were nothing more than another business deal. Richard's attorney began, laying out an argument that made Claire's stomach churn. Mr. Richard has the financial stability to provide these children with a superior quality of life, the lawyer stated confidently. He can ensure access to the best education, medical care, and a secure future. Claire clenched her fists. The words were polished, well-rehearsed, but she knew the reality was far from what they were painting. Then it was Amelia's turn. She stood with unwavering confidence. Your Honor, my client has dedicated her life to raising these children, Amelia began. She has been there for them through every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every challenge. Mr. Richard may have financial means, but Miss Claire has something far more valuable. A bond forged through years of love, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. The judge listened carefully to both sides. After deliberation, he made his decision. More investigation was needed before reaching a verdict. A social worker would be assigned to visit both Claire's and Richard's homes to assess their living conditions. After the hearing, Richard approached Claire in the hallway. He looked tired, but determined. I don't want to take them from you, he said quietly. I just want to be part of their lives. Claire exhaled sharply. You say that now, but dragging me to court wasn't exactly a peaceful way to handle things. Before Richard could respond, Stella appeared at his side, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "We just want what's best for the boys," she said, with a cool smile. Claire's blood boiled. "What's best for them?" she repeated. "I've given them love, security, and a stable home their entire lives. I don't need advice from you." Richard reached for her arm, his voice softer. "Claire, this doesn't have to be a war." She pulled away. "It already is." Without waiting for a response, Claire turned and walked away, doing her best to ignore the sinking feeling that this battle was far from over. In the days that followed, the tension only grew worse. Stella's presence became increasingly intrusive. At first, she started making appearances at the boys' school events, always dressed impeccably, flashing warm smiles at parents and forming connections with teachers. But then, whispers began spreading, rumors that painted Claire as an inattentive mother. The narrative was clear, and Claire had no doubt about its source. Things escalated further when the rumors reached the media. Articles started appearing, depicting Richard as a devoted father trying to reconnect with his children, while Claire was labeled as uncooperative, an obstacle in his path to shared parenting. Despite the sting of public judgment, Claire refused to back down. But Amelia, ever sharp, noticed that Stella's interference wasn't just about gossip. During a late-night conversation, she voiced her suspicions. "Claire, Stella isn't doing this just to help Richard. She has something to gain," Amelia said firmly. Claire frowned. "You think she wants more than just involvement?" "I'm sure of it," Amelia replied. "If she can push you out completely, she'll have full control over Richard, and over the boys. This isn't about love, Claire. It's about power." Claire knew Amelia was right. Stella was dangerous, and underestimating her would be a mistake. When the social worker's visit was scheduled, Claire prepared meticulously. She ensured everything reflected the warmth and love her children were raised with. During the interview, the boys spoke freely about their routines, the fun games they played, and the unwavering love their mother gave them. The social worker seemed impressed, but Claire knew there was another visit ahead, one to Richard's home. At Richard's residence, things were different. Stella had arranged everything to be picture perfect. The children's room was pristine, stocked with expensive toys the boys had never seen before. Richard did his best to appear relaxed, but Stella's controlling nature was hard to miss. Her carefully rehearsed responses caught the social worker's attention, and it was clear that something felt off. When the report finally arrived, no final decision had been made. But Claire found a small victory in knowing that the truth about Stella was starting to surface. Still, the battle was far from over. Richard continued to insist that he wanted to be involved in the boys' lives, while Stella did everything in her power to make Claire seem unfit. Claire knew she needed every ounce of strength to protect her children. Then, the trial day arrived. Claire hadn't slept the night before. Worries plagued her about her sons, their future, and the outcome of this case. As she entered the courthouse with Amelia by her side, she took a deep breath. The courtroom was packed, with dozens of eyes fixed on her. But she stood tall. Now was not the time to show weakness. On the other side of the room, Richard sat beside Stella and his attorney. He appeared composed, but Claire could sense his tension. Stella, on the other hand, radiated confidence. Her poised posture and unwavering stare suggested she believed she had already won. The judge began by reviewing the social worker's report. Claire listened intently as Amelia presented her case, highlighting the years of unwavering dedication Claire had given as a single mother. It was a story of struggle, sacrifice, and unconditional love, something Claire knew was her ultimate truth. Then, Richard's lawyer took the floor, and the atmosphere shifted. He argued that Richard had the financial stability to provide the children with a superior life, elite education, healthcare, and a future filled with opportunity. It was a well-crafted argument, designed to make Claire seem incapable of offering the same level of comfort. As she listened, Claire's heart clenched. She knew money played a role, but what she had, love, emotional security, and years of nurturing, was something wealth could never replace. Then came the moment of questioning. Amelia adjusted her blazer and stepped forward, locking eyes with Richard. "Mr. Richard, can you tell us why you chose to leave Claire 5 years ago?" A thick silence filled the room. Richard hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Finally, he exhaled. "My mother," he admitted. "She convinced me it wasn't the right time. She said marriage would be a mistake and that I needed to focus on my career." A murmur rippled through the audience. Claire felt her stomach twist. His words confirmed what she had always feared. He hadn't made the decision alone. Amelia didn't let up. "So, to clarify, you abandoned Claire at the altar because your mother influenced your decision?" Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, but ultimately, the choice was mine. I listened to her advice." Amelia nodded, then delivered a question that made the air in the courtroom shift. "And what about Stella? Did she play any role in that decision?" Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard. He glanced at Stella, who maintained her neutral expression. But Claire noticed something, a flicker of discomfort in Stella's eyes. Richard hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Stella had nothing to do with it." Amelia took a step back, but Claire wasn't convinced. The mere mention of Stella had left an undeniable tension in the air. Something was being left unsaid, and Claire was determined to uncover the truth. Something hung in the air, an unspoken truth no one seemed ready to confront. When Claire took the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words filled the room. "I've sacrificed everything to raise my boys. I did it alone, without help, without a safety net. I may not have wealth or luxury, but I've given them my heart, my time, my entire life. They are my reason to keep going, every single day." Her heartfelt testimony brought tears to the eyes of several onlookers. Even Richard appeared shaken. But Stella sat stiffly, her fingers curling into a fist. She leaned over and whispered something to Richard's lawyer, her restlessness apparent. The tension was thick, and sensing the growing emotions in the room, the judge called for a recess. When the session resumed, Amelia stood and made an unexpected request. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a new witness." The courtroom doors opened and a figure Claire hadn't seen in years stepped inside. Morgan, the former housekeeper of Richard's family. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes held firm determination. As she took the stand, Claire noticed Richard tensing in his seat. Across from him, Stella averted her gaze, her posture rigid. Morgan began speaking, her voice calm, but filled with conviction. "I worked for Richard's family for over 20 years, she said. "I was there during the days leading up to the wedding. I saw firsthand what happened behind closed doors." The room was silent as she continued. Richard's mother orchestrated everything. She convinced him that Claire wasn't good enough for their family, that marrying her would ruin his career. She played on his fears, twisting the truth, making him believe he had no choice. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Claire's heart clenched as she listened. She had always suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made the pain resurface. Morgan took a deep breath, then delivered another revelation. Stella was part of it too. The statement landed like a thunderclap. She was close to Richard's mother. She encouraged him to leave Claire. She agreed that he should walk away. The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers. Claire turned to Richard, who looked completely blindsided. His gaze flickered to Stella, confusion and anger creeping into his expression. "That's a lie!" Stella snapped, standing abruptly. The judge banged the gavel. "Order in the court." Richard turned to her, his voice low but heavy with disbelief. "You knew?" Stella's expression faltered. I was only looking out for you, for your future." Morgan's testimony had left a crack in the carefully constructed facade. Though the session was adjourned for the judge to review the new information, the damage had already been done. Claire left the courtroom with Morgan by her side, still processing everything. The years of pain, the struggles. It all felt finally acknowledged. But she knew this wasn't over yet. Across the hall, Richard stood frozen, looking lost, as if his world had just crumbled. Stella reached for him, but he pulled away, his trust in her shaken. As Claire walked past, she heard them arguing, though their words were muffled. The foundation of their relationship was cracking. Despite the relief of the truth coming to light, Claire knew the battle wasn't won yet. In the days following the courtroom revelation, Claire noticed a change in Richard. He started showing up for supervised visits, not out of obligation, but with genuine effort. It wasn't about extravagant gifts. Instead, he brought small, thoughtful things. Lucas's favorite book, a soccer ball for Liam, a new set of colored pencils for Noah, and a puzzle that fascinated Oliver. At first, the boys were hesitant, but Richard was patient. He listened. He joined their games. He got down on the floor with them, building puzzles and drawing silly pictures. Claire kept her distance, watching cautiously, but she couldn't deny that the boys' laughter around him was real. One afternoon, Richard arrived with a kite, determined to teach the boys how to fly it. The wind was perfect, and the four of them ran across the park, chasing the string, their excitement filling the air. Liam, the most competitive of them, managed to keep the kite soaring the longest. When he succeeded, Richard scooped him up in a joyous hug, his smile wider than Claire had ever seen. And for the first time, Claire saw something unexpected. Richard wasn't just trying, he was happy. As weeks passed, it became clear this wasn't just an act. Richard started taking an active interest in their lives. He asked about their schoolwork, their friends, their little victories and struggles. He took Noah to an art class, encouraged Oliver with new words he was learning, and cheered for Lucas when he solved a difficult math problem. And slowly, against all odds, he was becoming part of their world. These moments weren't extravagant, but they were real. They showed that Richard was truly making an effort to be present. Despite this, Claire remained guarded. No matter how much Richard seemed committed now, the past couldn't be erased so easily. There was too much history, too many disappointments that couldn't be ignored. Yet, she couldn't deny that something about him had changed. One evening, while tidying up the kitchen after dinner, Richard stepped in and quietly began helping her. He didn't say much at first, simply washing dishes alongside her. Then, in a low, almost hesitant voice, he finally spoke. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives, Claire. I know it's more than I deserve." Claire paused, gripping a plate in her hands. A part of her wanted to respond with something sharp, something to remind him that a few months of effort didn't erase years of absence. But when she looked at him, she saw something different. Genuine sincerity. He wasn't the same self-assured, arrogant man she had once known. He was someone trying, even if it was late. "They're happy," she said, simply, turning back to the sink. "That's what matters." Deep down, she knew that seeing her children smile made her happy too. As time passed, Richard's presence became natural to the boys. Lucas was the first to call him Dad during a game. Richard froze, clearly moved, but he didn't make a big deal of it. He just smiled and kept playing. Soon, the others followed, and Claire realized something undeniable. A real bond was forming. Still, she remained firm in her role. She continued raising the boys on her own, ensuring they knew that their mother was always their foundation. To her surprise, Richard respected that. He helped where he could, but he never overstepped. One evening, Richard arrived with a photo album. Handing it to Claire, he explained that it held memories from his childhood that he wanted to share with the boys. Claire flipped through the pages as he explained each photo. The boys listened intently, asking questions, laughing at the pictures of him as a child. It was a small gesture, but it showed Claire that Richard wasn't just trying to connect with the boys. He was also trying to rebuild something with her. While this new chapter unfolded, Stella refused to accept it. After everything that had been exposed in court, she had lost much of her influence over Richard. It wasn't just rejection that stung, it was the humiliation. She couldn't stand watching Richard form a new bond with Claire and the boys while she was left in the shadows. Fueled by anger, she began scheming. For weeks, she gathered information, pulling strings behind the scenes, crafting a plan to shatter the fragile peace forming between them. In her mind, Claire was the obstacle standing between her and Richard. The boys were nothing more than a complication she needed to remove. As Claire and Richard found an unexpected sense of understanding, and the boys grew comfortable with their father's presence, Stella made her move. One day, Claire received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, a cold voice cut through the silence. "You think this peace will last? Just wait and see what's coming?" Claire's blood ran cold. She knew exactly who it was. She refused to respond. Instead, she hung up and walked back into the living room, where Richard and the boys were laughing over a game. She knew Stella wouldn't give up easily. But this time, Claire was ready for a fight. Meanwhile, Stella continued her manipulations, determined to tear apart the bond forming between Richard, Claire, and the boys. She viewed the court's decision as temporary. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before she found a way to regain control, and she was willing to do whatever it took. Despite the looming tension, the days continued. The time Richard spent with the boys began shaping a new routine. Claire, ever watchful, allowed him to spend time with them, but always under her supervision. Richard never pushed back against the boundaries she set. He seemed to understand that trust had to be earned. At first, Claire kept her emotions locked away. She observed everything closely, waiting for signs that Richard might retreat again. But as the weeks passed, something became clear. He wasn't leaving this time. It wasn't just about playing with the boys. He was paying attention to the little things. He helped Lucas build a robot for a school project. He taught Liam how to kick a soccer ball with precision. He encouraged Oliver to conquer his fear of heights at the playground, and he carefully collected Noah's drawings, keeping them in a folder he brought with him every visit. One afternoon, as the boys played in the backyard, Richard offered to help Claire with dinner. She hesitated, but eventually handed him a knife to chop vegetables. He was clumsy, struggling with even slices, but he kept trying. "I never imagined you in the kitchen," Claire said, unable to hide her amused tone. Richard chuckled, continuing to fumble with the carrot. "I know. Honestly, I've never had to do this before," he admitted, smiling at her. "But maybe it's time I learn." Claire watched him for a moment, then turned back to the stove. There was something undeniably different about him. As much as she wanted to keep her guard up, she couldn't ignore the small, simple moments that kept shifting her perspective. That same evening, Richard surprised everyone by bringing out a guitar. He sat on the couch, the boys huddled around him, and started playing a simple tune. The chords weren't perfect, but the melody was warm. Then, he started singing a children's song, messing up the lyrics halfway through, making the boys burst into laughter. Standing in the kitchen doorway, Claire found herself smiling. Maybe, just maybe, things were changing in a way she never expected. Claire caught herself smiling, almost without realizing it. It had been a long time since she had seen her children so relaxed, so genuinely happy. Over the following weeks, the bond between the boys and Richard grew stronger in ways Claire hadn't anticipated. Liam, usually the most reserved, began asking when his father would be back as soon as he left. Noah, the artistic one, eagerly showed Richard his latest drawings, beaming at his father's compliments. Lucas wanted to play video games with him almost every day. And Oliver, though still shy, started mirroring Richard's gestures, as if trying to be just like him. The change was undeniable, yet Claire wrestled with her emotions. Part of her was glad to see the boys creating memories with their father. But another part of her feared What might happen if this new reality collapsed? Could she trust that this version of Richard was here to stay? One morning at the park, Richard sat beside Claire on a bench as they watched the boys tossing a frisbee back and forth. He let out a quiet sigh and turned to her, his expression serious. "Thank you for letting me be here, Claire," he said. "I know giving me another chance wasn't easy." She kept her eyes on the boys, choosing her words carefully. "It's not about trusting you, Richard," she said. "It's about them. They need stability, and I can't risk you disappearing again." Richard nodded, absorbing her words. "I get it, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As much as she wanted to doubt him, Claire couldn't deny that since returning, he had kept every promise he made. Maybe, just maybe, he was truly committed to being a father this time. That evening, as she tucked the boys into bed, Richard sat on the floor of their room, holding an old photo album. The children huddled around him, eager to learn about their father's childhood. He flipped through the pages, his voice filled with nostalgia. "When I was a kid, I loved building things," he shared. "One time, my dad gave me a toy toolbox, and I spent weeks trying to build a little house in the backyard. Of course, the first time it rained, it collapsed completely." The boys burst into laughter. Lucas grinned. "Can we build something together, Dad?" Richard smiled. "Of course. We'll start next weekend." As he continued sharing stories, one particular memory caught Oliver's attention. It was a picture of Richard with a building toy. Oliver leaned in, captivated, and started asking endless questions. Richard patiently explained every detail, his voice steady, his attention unwavering. From the doorway, Claire watched the light in Oliver's eyes and felt the weight of the moment. After the boys drifted off to sleep, Claire entered to turn off the lights. Richard remained on the floor, still flipping through the old album, a soft smile on his face. "Thank you for this," he murmured. "They're giving me something I didn't even realize I needed." Claire didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and walked away. But as she left the room, she couldn't deny that something inside her was shifting too. Maybe it was time to reconsider what she once thought impossible. Maybe it was time to forgive. The next morning, Richard arrived with tools and materials, ready to build a small wooden playhouse with the boys. The backyard quickly filled with laughter, the sound of tiny hammers clumsily hitting nails, and the occasional frustrated groan from Liam when something didn't go as planned. From the porch, Claire watched them work, a smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't just a weekend project, it was something bigger, something real. But even as she allowed herself to enjoy the moment, she remained cautious. She knew Stella wasn't finished. Claire could feel it in her bones. Something was coming. That night, as the boys slept, Claire reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. Richard was no longer the man he had been all those years ago. He still had flaws, but he was showing up. He was staying. He was proving, little by little, that he was in this for the long run. Perhaps it was time for Claire to lower her guard, just a little. Meanwhile, Stella watched from the sidelines, seething. She had lost control, and she knew it. Seeing Richard and Claire rebuild something that didn't include her, was unbearable. The way Richard looked at his children, the way Claire no longer saw him as the man who had abandoned her, the way the boys had begun to accept him without hesitation. It was all slipping away from her grasp. This wasn't just about losing Richard. It was about losing the influence she had worked so hard to maintain. She wouldn't let that happen, not without a fight. The days passed, settling into a new rhythm. Claire and Richard had found an unexpected ease in their co-parenting. Their conversations, once strained and cold, now felt natural. The emotional walls were still there, but they were thinning. Unlike before, Richard didn't try to force his way in. He was patient, careful, showing up without demanding anything in return. One afternoon, as Claire prepared lunch, Richard stepped into the kitchen, an envelope in hand. "Claire, Can we talk for a second? She turned, still guarded, but gave a small nod. Without speaking, he set the envelope on the counter and slid it toward her. When he finally spoke, his voice was calmer than she expected. I know I refused to help before, he admitted. And I know that was wrong. But this time is different. I want you to accept this. Claire hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a check, a significant amount, enough to cover months of expenses for the boys. She immediately shook her head. Richard, I don't need this, she said firmly. I've taken care of them on my own since the day they were born, and I'll keep doing it. Richard raised his hands in surrender but held her gaze. I know you can, Claire. I know how hard you've worked to give them everything. But this isn't about money. It's about being their father. I don't want this to be a burden on you anymore. Claire looked at the check again, conflicted. The old version of Richard, the man she once knew, would have thrown money at a problem and expected it to solve everything. But this wasn't that. This wasn't guilt. This was responsibility. And for the first time, Claire wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the past. Just enough to let something new begin. The Richard she once knew would have handed her the money with arrogance, as if it could solve everything. But now, something was different. There was no entitlement in his gesture, only humility. I'll think about it, Claire finally said, folding the check and tucking it back into the envelope. Richard simply nodded, not pushing her for an answer. That, in itself, surprised her. He was learning to respect the boundaries she had set. As the weeks passed, his commitment became even more evident. It wasn't just about financial support. He was fully engaged in the boys' lives. He drove them to school, helped with homework, and even took Claire's lead when handling their everyday struggles. Tantrums, scraped knees, broken toys. For Claire, it was strange to see someone who had once felt so distant now fully present. One evening, after a long day, they both sat on the porch while the boys slept. The moon cast a soft glow over the backyard, where the remnants of their wooden playhouse project were still scattered. You know, Richard said, breaking the silence, I never imagined I'd be here. Claire glanced at him, curious. What do you mean? Here, he gestured toward the house, the yard. With you. With them. He exhaled, shaking his head. For years, I was so focused on work, on living up to expectations, that I didn't see what really mattered. Now that I'm finally trying to make things right, I keep wondering, why did it take me so long? Claire crossed her arms, leaning against the door frame. Sometimes we only realize what's important when we've almost lost it. Richard nodded, but there was something in his expression, something heavier. He hesitated before speaking again. Claire, I need to tell you something about that day. She felt her body tense. For years, she had carried the weight of that moment, the heartbreak, the humiliation. Some wounds had begun to heal, but others still hurt. Even so, she nodded, signaling for him to continue. My mother didn't just convince me to walk away from the wedding, he admitted, his voice low. She threatened to cut me off completely. She said if I married you, I'd be on my own. Claire blinked, caught off guard. So, you left me because you were afraid of losing her money? It wasn't just the money, Richard said quickly, shaking his head. It was everything. She controlled every part of my life. I was a coward, Claire. Instead of fighting back, I took the easy way out. I ran. And I know, nothing I say will make up for that. But you deserve the truth. Claire felt a rush of emotions, anger, understanding, sadness. The pieces were finally coming together. You should have told me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We could have faced it together. I would have stood by you. Richard looked down, regret clear in his eyes. I know, he said. I was young and stupid. And I've lived with that choice every single day since. The silence between them was heavy, but something inside Claire shifted. The truth didn't erase the past. It didn't take away the years of pain. But it was something. A step forward. She let out a quiet sigh. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Richard, but at least now I know why. He nodded, accepting her words with humility. That's all I can ask for. The next morning, as the boys ran toward Richard, wrapping their arms around him in excitement, Claire watched from a distance. For the first time in years, she felt something real, something different. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally beginning to change. The courtroom was packed once again. Claire arrived early, gripping Amelia's hand tightly. She took slow, deep breaths, trying to steady herself. Since learning the full truth about why she had been abandoned at the altar, she had felt less lost. But that didn't mean she was ready to forgive. The tension between her and Richard had eased, but the weight of the legal battle still loomed over her. Richard entered the courtroom soon after, his lawyer beside him. But today, something about him was different. He wasn't the man she had once known, the one who'd walked away so easily. Today, he was serious, focused. And one other thing was different. Stella was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was noticeable, though no one dared to question it. Claire had a feeling she knew exactly why. Claire assumed that after everything that had been revealed, Stella had chosen to step away to avoid further humiliation. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Both sides presented their final arguments. Amelia, sharp and precise as ever, emphasized the deep emotional bond Claire had built with the boys, and how she had been their one constant, their unwavering protector. Richard's lawyer, in contrast, argued that he had shown real commitment to being a father, and that his presence in their lives was crucial for their well-being. When Richard was called to testify, Claire watched him closely. He spoke with a calm sincerity, openly admitting his past mistakes and taking responsibility for his choices. He didn't try to shift blame or make excuses. Instead, he acknowledged Claire's doubts and expressed his determination to earn not only her trust, but also the trust of his children. I don't expect Claire to forgive me right away, he said, his voice steady. But I'm here because I want to be the father my children deserve, and I won't give up on them. His words echoed through the room. Claire felt something stir within her, but she kept her expression unreadable. It was still difficult to believe in him completely, but he seemed genuine. When it was Claire's turn to speak, she stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress with slightly trembling hands. But when she spoke, her voice was strong. For 5 years, I have been everything my children had. I raised them alone, through struggles only a single mother can understand. They are my absolute priority, and I will always do what is best for them. If that means allowing Richard to be in their lives, I am willing to consider it. But let me be clear, trust is not something I will give freely. The judge listened carefully, taking in both statements. After hours of deliberation, he returned with his decision. Primary custody will remain with Miss Claire. However, Mr. Richard will be granted regular visitation and active participation in the children's upbringing. Both parents are expected to work together to ensure the well-being of their children. Claire felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. It was a fair decision, but what it would mean in the long run remained to be seen. Richard, on the other hand, looked grateful. He met Claire's gaze, offering a small smile. After a pause, she gave him a brief nod in return. As people began leaving the courtroom, a familiar presence appeared. Stella. She stood in front of Richard, her expression unreadable. Do you really think you can be this perfect father now? She asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Richard met her gaze, his expression calm. I'm going to try, he said, simply. And that's what matters. Stella let out a dry laugh, but there was bitterness in her eyes. Good luck with that, she muttered. You're on your own now." With that, she turned and walked away, making it clear that she was done. For Claire, it was a relief. Without Stella's interference, things could finally move forward without manipulation or drama. Later that day, Richard showed up at Claire's house. He had come to see the boys, but Claire could tell there was something else on his mind. The boys ran to him as soon as he arrived, greeting him with eager hugs. Claire watched quietly from the kitchen, observing the interaction. After the kids had gone to their rooms, Richard hesitated before approaching her. "Claire, can we talk?" She nodded, leading him to the living room. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching between them, before he finally spoke. "I want to thank you for letting me be part of their lives," he began. "I know it hasn't been easy for you, but there's something else I need to say." Claire frowned, both curious and cautious. "What is it?" Richard exhaled, his hands clasped together as if steadying himself. "I still love you, Claire. I always have. I know it's too late to say this, but I needed you to know." The words caught Claire off guard. She stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. For years, she had carried the pain of his betrayal, but beneath it all, buried deep, were also memories of love. Hearing this now, after everything, left her conflicted. "Richard, I don't know what to say," she admitted. "A lot has happened. This isn't something that words alone can fix." "I know," he said, offering a sad smile. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know. And if one day you're ready to think about something beyond the past, I'll be here." Claire didn't answer right away. Richard didn't push. He simply stood, said goodnight, and left. As he walked away, Claire felt a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved to finally hear the truth. On the other, she knew there was still so much to process. She looked toward the boys' room, listening to their laughter. For now, they were her focus. Richard was trying to make amends, and maybe, someday, she would be ready to consider what he had said. But for now, her priority remained the same: protecting and raising her children. Months passed, and their lives settled into a new rhythm. Richard was no longer just a visitor in the boys' lives. He was a constant presence. He showed up for school events, helped with homework, and made time for them every single week. But something else had changed. His relationship with Claire had shifted too. At first, their conversations were only about the children. Then over time, they became easier, more natural. Shared lunches, late-night talks, quiet moments with the boys, something neither of them had expected had started to take shape. One afternoon, during a trip to the park, the boys ran off to play, leaving Claire and Richard sitting side by side on a bench. Richard took a deep breath, seeming unusually nervous, something that wasn't like him. Claire turned to him, curious. "What is it?" she asked. Richard hesitated, then finally met her gaze. "I need to ask you something." "Claire, I've been thinking," Richard started, his voice filled with hesitation. "About us. About everything." She turned to him, waiting for him to continue. "What about it, Richard?" "Maybe we should try again," he admitted, meeting her gaze. "Not just for the boys, but because I want to. I want to prove to you that I can be the man you deserve." Claire stayed silent for a moment, her eyes drifting to where their children were playing in the distance. The months they had spent together had proven that Richard had changed. He was more patient, more humble, and despite all the pain of the past, something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was worth considering. "It won't be easy, Richard," she finally said. "There's a lot we need to work through." He nodded, a small but hopeful smile crossing his face. "I know," he said, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The months that followed felt like a new beginning. Claire and Richard rediscovered their connection, this time with more maturity and with their children as their top priority. Small gestures began to matter the most. A home-cooked meal after a long day, a text of encouragement before a stressful meeting. The simple, unguarded laughter they shared as they watched their boys chase each other around the yard. One afternoon, Richard planned a picnic outside the city in a field of blooming flowers. The sky was a brilliant blue, a gentle breeze stirring the petals as the boys ran freely through the meadow. As they played, Richard turned to Claire. "Walk with me?" he asked, holding something in his hand, though he kept it hidden. Curious, Claire followed him to a quiet spot with a breathtaking view. Richard stopped, turning to face her. "Claire," he began, his voice full of emotion, "you've shown me what love really is, not just for me, but for our children. You're the reason I've become a better man, a better father." He took a deep breath. "I don't want this second chance to be temporary. I want it to last forever." Slowly, he opened his hand, revealing a small velvet box. When he lifted the lid, a simple yet elegant ring sparkled inside, reflecting the sincerity in his eyes. Claire felt her breath catch. For so long, she had wondered what she would do if this moment ever happened. She had imagined all the possibilities, all the doubts. But in this moment, there was no hesitation. "Yes, Richard," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I will." From a distance, their children had been watching. Seeing what had just happened, they erupted into cheers, sprinting toward their parents. Lucas was the first to reach them. "Mommy, are you getting married?" he asked, his eyes shining. "Are we going to be a real family?" Claire knelt down, pulling them all into a hug. "Yes, my loves," she said, her voice full of warmth. "We're going to be a family." In the months that followed, their home was filled with laughter and the joyful chaos of wedding preparations. The boys insisted on helping with everything. Lucas wanted to pick the cake. Noah spent hours designing flower arrangements. Liam practiced a speech he had written himself, and Oliver proudly declared that he would walk his mother down the aisle. When the big day finally arrived, it was held in a beautiful garden, surrounded by their closest friends and family. Every detail carried a special touch from their children. Lucas carried the rings. Noah decorated the space with carefully placed flowers. Liam stood up proudly to deliver his heartfelt speech. And Oliver, grinning ear to ear, walked Claire down the aisle. As Claire and Richard exchanged vows, it felt as though the past had finally been put to rest. This was a new beginning, a future they had built together, through every hardship, every mistake, and every moment of redemption. After the ceremony, the celebration was filled with love. The boys ran around the garden, playing tag between the tables. Claire and Richard shared a dance under a canopy of glowing lights. Holding her close, Richard whispered in her ear. "I promise you, Claire," he murmured, "I'll spend the rest of my life making you and the boys happy." Claire smiled, leaning into him, her heart lighter than it had felt in years. "We're together now, Richard," she whispered back, "and that's all that matters." That night, before bed, the boys gathered their parents for a surprise. With proud smiles, they handed over a homemade album filled with their drawings, each page depicting moments of happiness, moments of love. On the last page, in big, uneven letters, they had written, "Our family is forever." Claire clutched the album to her chest, overwhelmed by emotion. For the first time in years, she knew without a doubt. This journey, which had begun with so much heartbreak, had led to something beautiful. A family built on love, patience, and the courage to start over. What do you think? Did Claire make the right choice by forgiving Richard? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. How would you score it? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more emotional stories. Check out more powerful stories by clicking here on the end screen.